All right, welcome back to the Protocol Town Hall, a guest talk series every 2 weeks focused on protocols and protocol research. Today, we are talking with Timber Schroff, a Summer of Protocols core researcher, about his research project titled Safe New World, which is about safety protocols. Our next town hall will be on Wednesday, November 8th with Simon Delavoir. You can find the program calendar along with pre-meeting reading materials linked in the program calendar at summerofprotocols.com. So with that, I will pass it off to Venkat to introduce our core researcher, Timber.
All right. So Timber is going to be doing the second of the report out from the Summer of Protocols. And we were really excited to have Timber in the program because he was bringing a view into kind of like traditional industry, 20th century, 19th century stuff. As you'll see from his project, it's about safety protocols in the coal industry. But the broader point I want to make is this program, since it's funded by the Ethereum Foundation, it started initially with like very bleeding edge protocol questions relating to blockchains. And it's been really interesting to see people make connections to all sorts of other domains that are like very precise and on point, not vague and like vague analogies. And Tim's not here today, but in a couple of podcasts we've done, Tim often references Timber's work as an example of why studying protocols in general and doing like protocol studies is important, because you find that, hey, the problems that blockchains and other modern protocols are facing are actually weirdly similar to problems that industries like coal mining faced in like 1910 or whenever, right? So it's kind of really interesting and stimulating to hear about these low-level connections. So over to you, Timber.
Thanks, Venkat. Hey, everybody. I'll share some slides here. There we go. Yep. So today I'll be talking about my essay and the work I did this summer about protocols with the other researchers. Like Venkat mentioned, my essay is a little bit different from a few of the others, as it's more grounded in kind of low-tech historical study of the coal mine industry in both Europe and the US, mainly the US. In the essay, I propose a theory of protocol evolution, which I hope applies to protocols in general. And it's based on a pattern of social change driven by mutation and selection effects. So this is very much an application of evolutionary thinking applied to protocols. The big case study is safety protocols in coal mining and how that's changed over time. So from 1900 to 2000, we went from a ton of people getting hurt in coal mining to basically nobody. So there's a 97% decrease in coal mining fatalities over 100 years, which is pretty amazing. We'll get to that later. This is just one of many different types of important protocols, which I came to realize over the summer. And I highly encourage everybody to continue joining these town halls as they're super interesting. A little bit of background of me before I get into it. I've worked for a couple governments in Canada, working on projects from like quantum computing, setting up not-for-profit research institute for that, and to workplace safety. And surprising to me was the second problem was much harder. Like workplace safety to me felt like kind of a simple problem rather than trying to set up a quantum computing research institute. But it turns out that something about the nature of safety, workplace safety, was much more complicated and tricky than I thought it was. And this thinking about it in terms of protocols and evolution really helped me figure out why that was. So we'll get into this presentation now. First, I'll talk about safety, a little bit about the case study, and then I'll talk about evolution, how it works with protocols, what are the mechanisms of mutation and variation. I'll talk about those pressures combining and what happens, and the resulting set of protocols that we see today. Then I'll move on to application. I like to leave a good amount of time about application because taking this concept of protocols, which is very much first class problem solving concept to me, and taking it into the real world is what I would like to see moving ahead with my work. And I'll leave a good chunk of time for a Q&A, as for whatever reason people like to talk about safety. It's kind of this ubiquitous concept. So I'll leave about 20 to 25 minutes for Q&A at the end. So first of all, going to be a little bit pedantic and go into a definition of safety. A lot of people ask, what is safety really? And that already gets us on the wrong track, because safety is something that doesn't happen. So safety is a non-thing. Safety is when accidents don't happen. Accidents are a type of event, and events can only happen if there's some underlying activity. And in the case of coal mining, that activity is work. And activity varies. We don't do it precisely the same every time. The outcome varies as well. So activities are dynamic. And safety is therefore a dynamic non-event. It's this thing around us that we try and control the presence of through the reduction of accidents and the removal of risk. So protocols in this context are things that can create, sustain, and scale dynamic non-events like safety. And going forward too, I'll be talking about safety and health and how these are very important problems in their own rights, but they're slightly different. They're both non-events, they're both dynamic, but they vary in some important respects. So safety is about preventing acute harm from happening at one point in time, like the collapse of a coal mining shaft, for example, whereas health would be trying to prevent coal miners from developing lung cancer over time, or black lung. There are shorter feedback loops in safety. It's more obvious if you're doing something that's dangerous, whereas with health, it can take decades for symptoms of black lung to emerge, for the same example. Safety is hard to see. Health is even harder to see. And then the kind of contentious point that I've come to realize about safety is we've more or less, with the help of protocols, solved the problem. It's a matter of application now. We know what to do. It's just not being done everywhere, and it's not being done perfectly, nor can it be. And with health, on the other hand, it's still a big issue. The top 3 work-related causes of death today in the past decade have all been chronic disease. So chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, ischemic heart disease, and stroke, rather than any sort of car accident or workplace accident. It's more of a health crisis now in the workplace. So the Alfred North Whitehead quote has been sort of a cornerstone of this summer's work for everybody. And when we kind of transmutate it over to safety and in the language of dynamic non-events, we can think about it in terms of safety and health advancing by extending the number of important non-events which we can sustain without thinking of them. So we've got all these risks around us that rarely manifest. So if you think about you going for a walk to the grocery store, if you live in a city, you're crossing several lanes of 10 meters at a time that have chunks of metal that weigh 4,000 pounds hurtling at 50 kilometers an hour, and you don't get hit by them. And that's why you're here. And we don't even think about it, but there's all these protocols involved in preventing that, and like getting you to work safely and getting you home from work safely and having you do your job safely. And we rarely think about them, and they're super boring. And that's why sometimes safety people are not the best people to have at parties. But they do serve an important job. And so what we've seen in the coal industry is this massive decline in fatalities from, several thousand a year all the way down to basically zero. And at the same time, a massive increase in the production of coal. So millions and billions of tons of coal being produced, and growth in the amount of coal being produced, but a steep decline in the number of fatalities have happened. And so there's this very big question, which is, how did we get here? how is this possible? Is it because of economic changes? Is it because of technology? Is it because we have shifting norms? And all those have been talked about quite a bit. There have been big changes in human worker rights, changes in wealth, changes in technology, changes in our knowledge about how we mine coal, about what types of coal to mine. But one missing angle, in my opinion, which is why I was so excited about this summer and this summer's research, was protocols. So is there a more worker-centric explanation about how behavior factors into all of this? And that's what I sought to answer here. So in the history of coal mining, we've gone through big changes in the dominant safety protocols and the way that coal is mined. So before 1700, it was all very low tech. It was families of serfs mining coal for a lord on a plot of land and pulling it out of the ground by hand. There was no equipment, really. It was all made of wood. There were some, animals used for power, but that's about it. But then, so in that situation, you had really, really early protocols for detecting gas, which you didn't even see much of. You had some protocols for the spacing of mine shafts. That was the first protocol ever invented, was in this little town in Europe that said that mine shafts had to be such and such a distance apart in order to prevent the collapse of them. So very early on, you see the start of this intentional restriction of human behavior. And then it kind of gets out of hand with the advent of the steam engine and the Industrial Revolution. There was this big technology boom. Safety protocols didn't keep up. This was a very dangerous time to be mining coal. But we did see the invention of early masks and helmets and apprenticing models of learning, where newer workers would come in and get paired with older workers where possible, even just as assistants. And it was kind of this accidental, on the ground first response to these new hazards resulting from technology. And we saw a bit of a social order change come with all that technology progressing very rapidly. Fast forward to the 1850s into the early 1900s, and you've got these big coal companies that have, tens or hundreds of employees, but you have old ways of thinking about employment. So people think they're mining coal, they got paid on a piece wage. Coal miners were treated more as entrepreneurs than employees. And another thing that happened was the mines got really, really big. And for the first time in coal mining history, the fates of miners were linked together. So your behaviors affected the people next to you because there was so much dust and gas in mines. If you did something wrong, it could blow up the whole mine and kill hundreds of people, which is what happened in the Moningo mine disaster, which killed almost 400 people in the US. In fact, miners didn't want to acknowledge that their fates were so closely tied. And there's this really interesting role of miners looking out for their own safety, but also not acknowledging some things that they could do that could greatly improve their well-being. The classic example being smoking in mines. Coal miners in the 1910s, the US Department of Mines said, okay, smoking in mines is now illegal. And then coal miners went on strike saying, this is too much of a restriction on us. This is a restriction of our freedom. And eventually it became illegal to smoke in coal mines. But it just goes to show that protocols can be invented both by workers, by governments, by the private sector. There are lots of different reasons to create protocols, and there are lots of different barriers to protocols being created, both by those who would benefit from them and by those who would, have to bear the costs, as in the case of the smoking example. After the 1950s, you see a diminishing return on safety, which can be well explained by this graph here. The protocols that were being invented were no longer reducing fatalities year over year at the same rate. There were lots being invented, but safety experts in the coal industry were now relying on things like behavioral interventions, psychological interventions. They're studying like personality matches to certain job types, trying to reorder work in a way that would increase the alertness of workers to reduce their risk of accidents. And this is all very much a different cost to benefit ratio than what was happening before with protocols around dust management, explosives management, gas detection, things that scaled really well versus these other problems that are just kind of inherent in the complexity of the world around us that we can't eliminate. When you have all these different moving parts, things go bad, people get hurt. There's a certain number of fatalities that are going to be difficult to get rid of without just completely getting rid of the industry. If you remove activity, there are no events, there can be no accidents. If you stay at home all day, you'll be okay. Anyway, moving on to the present, so 2000 to today, we see the rise of emotional ergonomics and psychological safety. We see this big trend towards promoting like well-being at work. We've gone from the question of don't die at work to don't get hurt at work to don't get your feelings hurt at work to being happy in your job to being fulfilled. And it's this progression, which is a sign of a very positive improvement in the physical reality of getting hurt at work. But it also begs the question, how much can we spend on this stuff and get accidents and fatalities down? And one thing I realized in this research was that safety management teams are probably spending way too much on safety protocols and very much not enough on health protocols. If we look at the top causes of work-related death today, again, none of them are accident related. They're all chronic disease related. So trying to come up today with a better set of protocols to improve worker well-being is going to be more a question about improving health protocols rather than safety protocols. But this is all a sign that safety protocols evolved in such a way that they did solve the problem of workplace fatalities. So how did these protocols evolve? And how did they succeed in their goal of negotiating the relationship between workers who want to maximize their safety and leisure and employers who want to maximize productivity, throughput, and minimize cost? This is the theory of protocol evolution that I came up with over the summer as kind of a high-level snapshot. This is described in a lot more detail in the essay. But roughly speaking, the process of protocol evolution is driven by technological progress on the one hand and changes in the environment on the other hand, both of which affect the set of existing hazards. So technological progress, like the creation of steam engines, removed some risks. Like they were able to create pumps that remove the water out of mines. So the collapse of a mine when it's dry is much lower. So that hazard got basically eliminated through the technological progress of steam engines. On the other hand, it allowed mines to be dug deeper and deeper, which created a new hazard, added a hazard to the set of gases and explosions. So to cope with these new hazards, the first reaction can't be technological progress again, because it's too slow. It can't be a shift in the environment because that requires engineering. So the first set of solutions to the new hazards are protocols, which are just changes in human behavior that we create that will reduce exposure to hazards or reduce the likelihood of a hazard being encountered. Those protocols, say for example, the use of canaries, you bring a canary into the mine to detect if there's gas there, is going to require a different social order to maintain that protocol. So individual human changes in behavior need to be sustained by larger scale changes in the social order so that when people come into that work environment, they are integrated into this pattern of behavior. They're able to pass it on to new people that come in. And basically there's this pattern of onboarding that needs to be maintained in the social order, and people need to follow protocol. If they don't follow protocol, they'll get ejected from the social order. So in that sense, the hazard leads to the creation of new protocols, which leads to the creation of a new protocol-based social order. And that new social order in turn can create new hazards. For the classic example would be consulting firms today are probably not the greatest place to work. In the last protocol town hall that Angela talked about, she talks a lot about law firms and how those have a lot of psychosocial hazards that are created as a result of the social order. The social order affects the direction of technological progress. It directs how we invest in certain technologies. And a protocol-based social order can create directly new protocols that may or may not be related to an existing hazard. And one historical case of that was some miners in the United Kingdom had a very large suspicion around goblins in the mines, and there were certain protocols to manage your luck and whether or not a goblin would harass you or mess with the structural integrity of the mine. And that didn't really have anything to do with an actual hazard, but for some reason that social order created this make-believe protocol. And then you see around at the bottom, around protocols, there are these different dynamics. So protocols can mutate and die, they get born, and they are selected. The evolution of protocols requires two things. On the one hand, it requires variation. So protocols need to change. There need to be new ones created that are slightly different from the existing ones, or we would see no change at all. And then there needs to be selection. There needs to be some forces that eliminate protocols with a bad fit, same as we would see with a biological organism, that would lead in the realm of safety protocols to better and better results for workplace fatalities. So the reduction of those workplace fatalities happened. Protocols changed over time. So I think that there is variation in selection. And the reason it's important to understand the mechanisms behind this variation in selections is once we do, we can figure out how to speed up the process of protocol creation in new industries like solar or batteries in order to reduce that curve and flatten it even faster than we saw in the coal mining industry, which took 100 years. If we could flatten that curve in 50 years, we would save thousands of lives in new industries. So protocols can mutate or vary in 3 different stages. When you enact a protocol, you are replicating it. So you're taking your understanding of that protocol and putting it into action. You're playing it out. When you're in a mine, miners will at intersections flash their lights to indicate that they're crossing through the intersection. So you flashing your lights is replicating the protocol. When you see somebody else replicate a protocol, you perceive them doing it, or if you're being taught how to do it, that's you perceiving how that protocol should be replicated and the information in that protocol. And finally, you're not performing the protocol, you're not following the protocol all the time. You have to store it in your mind or somewhere else. And you compress it, and then you decompress it at a different point. So at any of these stages of a protocol being replicated, so enacted, or being taught, or learned, or being stored, errors can happen. You can say, oh, I'm supposed to flash my lights twice. You can, just be sleepy. You could not flash your lights. You could flash the wrong color set of lights. You could forget about it eventually and then try and remember it. And you're like, okay, am I supposed to flash my lights or honk? And you're like, oh, I'm supposed to honk. So there are lots of errors that can happen, and most of them are small. And what this leads to is a great variation in this process of replication, perception, and storage, which on its own is a bad thing. But when you have selection, that means that new variations of protocols that better serve their purpose. So if it's found out that honking is not very effective because people have their earplugs in, but flashing lights is because nobody's wearing sunglasses in a mine, this is very good because that new protocol will be selected for by miners. Miners that are using that protocol are more likely to benefit from it. They're less likely to get into a collision. They're more likely to come to work the next day. So over time, there are these various forces that drive the selection of better and better safety protocols. Some of the factors that are involved in the selection I've found to be, these are a few. I've put, I think, between 10 and 13 of these environmental selection pressures in the essay, and it talks like in way more detail about the diamond sandwich. So all the pressure from the environment and variation, so selection and variation that come together and create better, stronger protocols for safety. But I'll go through a couple here. So influence, who does the protocol benefit? So if a protocol is benefiting the power, like the quote unquote powerful and the dynamic in the workplace, this has historically been the employer. So if a protocol is more beneficial for the employer, it's more likely to be selected for. Those powerful people can exert their preferences on others. So, for example, this is not a coal mining example, but this is an example that'll be more relevant to people here, is the selection of what vehicle to drive on the road. When you have SUVs, which are more expensive and safer because they're higher up, they're heavier, they have more built-in protection, you have to have more power to translate into purchasing an SUV than you would to buy a smart car. A smart car is much cheaper than a Jeep Cherokee. The difference is this drive to buy an SUV for personal safety reduces the safety of other people, and gradually you see this shift where people are buying more and more SUVs because those that can afford it are doing it, and those that can't afford it are forced to do it because powerful people opted into this protocol, which is beneficial to them, and gradually everybody else is onboarded. Another one, feedback. Does the protocol give rapid returns? If you're following a protocol, say you're not following a protocol and you're in a coal mine in Texas where there are a bunch of rattlesnakes and you're not wearing boots, you're going to feel a sense of anxiety very, very quickly if you're wearing sandals in the mine and there's rocks falling everywhere. You're probably going to hurt yourself very quickly. So the choice to wear steel-toed boots in a mine is very obvious because the feedback is quick. You'll experience an accident or an injury within no time in certain environments. But when it comes to a different problem, a different dynamic non-event, like sustaining a reasonable level of insulin resistance, this feedback loop is very, very long. It's hard to see when your decisions are compromising that dynamic non-event versus sustaining it. Bandwidth, this is a really important one for protocols, which is, in a few ways, is the protocol efficient and is it thorough? So is the trade-off between its costs and benefits good enough to fit into the rest of the protocols that we follow? Our bandwidth to follow protocols is limited in three ways. It's limited by our physical ability to enact the protocol. It's limited by our ability to learn it and to store it mentally. So is the protocol easy to remember? Is it easy to explain and pass on to other people? And is it easy to enact? And are the benefits associated with following that protocol great enough to the follower, for that person to justify staying with that protocol, paying the costs of it, following it day in and day out? In the case of safety protocols, you're often doing stuff that seems fairly monotonous and you don't see the benefits because you are sustaining a dynamic non-event. And this is tricky. If the benefits are not obvious, you're not going to be able to justify the bandwidth that you can afford to these things. So moving ahead to application, what were my big takeaways from this essay in terms of application of protocol evolution theory? I broke down protocol creation into 3 rough categories. First one is mutations. So these are the ones that happen in replication, perception, and storage just naturally. It leads to drift over time because better protocols are selected for. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got design. So this is what we see in a lot of organizations today trying to improve safety, is they're starting from scratch saying, okay, we need new protocols. We're going to design it with a team. We have these process consultants, and you're trying to do it from scratch to find the most optimal protocol. But what happens is that protocol falls way outside the horizon of efficiency that's acceptable to protocol followers. And so these design protocols are much more likely to die upon impact with users than just slightly mutated ones that we see day to day. And I think the sweet spot for the application of protocol creation theory would be in tinkering. So working with existing protocols and just altering them slightly in order to get a greater benefit on some dimension. So if that is a health protocol, for example, you're saying, all right, we've got a safety protocol that requires people to, we have to de-ice the sidewalks, for example. So could you de-ice more of the sidewalk to encourage people to walk more for further distances? Would be a way to tinker with an existing safety protocol to modify it to achieve a different goal, to sustain a different dynamic non-event. So this hits that sweet spot of being able to create agency in protocols to make our ability to change them greater, but without relying too much on having a really strong like carrot or stick existing that you can use to coerce people into following this new protocol that you created. And while that does happen sometimes, as in the case with coal mining, like smoking in coal mines, there are very few areas in health and safety today where there's enough potential return for safety and health to justify such a big change in safety protocols. But in other fields, I think there are opportunities for returns that would justify the design of novel protocols. So moving ahead, I think in general, protocols are becoming a first-class concept, especially for problems rooted in patterns of human behavior, which are most problems. One example that came out recently was this study about the roots of the ecological overshoot crisis in human behavior. I think more and more people are turning to changing human behavior at a small scale and nudging it as a way of solving these big emergent problems like climate change, pollution, garbage. How do we fix the recycling problem? And if you're able to turn the knobs at an individual level in a way that protocol is easily transmissible, easy to follow, and there are great benefits, the return on that is huge because of the information technology infrastructure we built today. You can transmit a protocol across the world. It's just a matter of making protocols that are close enough to existing patterns of behavior that they get adopted, and you slowly work your way into a more suitable pattern of behavior. So that was kind of a rush 35 minutes. I feel like it's hard to cram a 6,000 word essay into a 35-40 minute talk, but if you've got any questions, there's a ton of info on summerprotocols.com that you can check out. If you want to get in touch with me, you can go to timberschroff.com. And I don't know if there'll be an update on when stuff's getting published, but I'll open things up for a Q&A now if anybody has any questions. And there's the slides in the Discord, which I'll also drop a link into the Zoom chat if anybody wants to open those up.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Timber. Questions from people here? Go ahead and raise your hand. Yeah, let's start with Dorian.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Timber. I have a question. I have a couple. Number one, I'm interested in where the term emotional ergonomics comes from. And I'm also interested in the kind of response that you've gotten using coal mining, which is not especially en vogue topic, as an example, just in circulating this in other places.
I don't know what the true like emotional ergonomics canon is, but Shoya, who's in the call, brought it up to me, and I thought that was a good term and a little bit more appropriate for the conversation about psychological safety, because I think what people are trying to do is create an environment that's more in line with our long-term well-being, rather than like avoiding acute psychological harm. And as for the reaction to coal mining as a case study, I think I've been surprised at how much it's resonated with people. I picked it because there was such a long historical record, and that's been really good at eliciting a narrative about protocol evolution. I think people forget quickly that we're even talking about coal mining, and then we move on to some abstract conversation. But it's a good conversation starter.
Thank it. Question. You're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I was thinking about a particular aspect of safety protocols, which is, I would say, a mix of counterintuitiveness and non-obviousness. And the specific example I'm thinking of is this video I just saw on Twitter a few days back of somebody learning to shoot a gun. And what happened was his wrist was too limp. So the kickback from the first shot sort of like whipped the gun back nearly vertical, and he accidentally pulled the trigger again, and a bullet went into the ceiling. And there's a lot of, like, of course, making fun of him, including points like, yeah, he's lucky he didn't go 180 degrees and shoot him. But one of the interesting replies was, this is why when you're learning to shoot, you should really just have one bullet in the gun until you learn to, control your wrist and firmness. So that's, to me, a non-obvious thing. If I were like just screwing around trying to learn to shoot myself, it would not occur to me to like just start with one bullet in the gun, for example. So there's a bunch of things like this. Anytime I look at things to do with safety, I'm often I'm blanking on more and better examples, but I remember several cases vaguely where when I'm taught a safety behavior, it's nearly always counterintuitive or non-obvious. So comments on that, examples from that, your readings and research?
I think it's so present in every safety and health discussion. It's because you're trying to optimize for something that doesn't exist. You're trying to push something out of existence, like these accidents. And the better that you do at following protocol, the fewer of these accidents happen, and the easier it is for us to forget about the protocols to begin with. So when it comes to gun handling, it's like there are fewer and fewer instructors that teach people how to handle guns well. And eventually, if you got to a point where there were no gun accidents happening, those gun handling instructors would probably go out of business, because if you looked at the data, guns were no longer dangerous. And you got this catch-22 where it's like you need to have people remember these counterintuitive protocols. And do you have enough resources to continue investing in remembering these counterintuitive protocols? It's a tricky thing to convince people of the importance of these things. especially if the feedback loop is long, as in the case with health protocols. I wish I had
Related
another
to that, I
example.
think, the feedback loops, if you're successful, actually get longer, right? So if you think about the time between gun accidents in this particular mode making the news, therefore everybody's sensitized to this particular kind of accident, the better the safety protocols are, the fewer such accidents. So the feedback loop that happens sort of like in an unplanned way gets longer and longer. It's like, Taleb's black swan, rare events kind of thing. And at some point, this particular pattern of accident may become a black swan. So it's become so long-term feedback that very few people are aware that it's a way you can kill yourself.
So Venkat and Timber, based on this assumption, if we have a black swan today, it might be that we had a protocol in place that we've potentially neglected.
Yeah, for sure.
And we've potentially forgotten the protocol.
Yeah, I think that happens. I've just been working my way through the technical in Certo. But one example are big floods. So these floods don't happen very often. And the town where I'm from in Washington State occasionally will have these big floods. And it's on people like my 90-year-old grandpa to remember and convince people like, hey, like we shouldn't build a house there. It's a flood zone. But he's the only person around that remembers it. And the other thing to consider is the last disaster that happened, like the high water mark, because it's one of these black swan events, you need to assume that the next high water mark is going to be way higher than you'd expect. And that leads to some really counterintuitive behaviors where it's like, we shouldn't build housing there because it might get destroyed in 50 years. But right now there's a shortage of housing and that's the cheapest place to build it. So you're making these, in the short run, very contradictory decisions to the benefit of people that are only going to live in that area for 20 years. And they're like, what's the point? But you're making perhaps optimal long run decisions, which just look really, really silly in the present.
One follow-up question then. In your research, Timber, did you find any solutions for remembering protocols like this? Like for example, there might be like old mining protocols that got like wrapped into new types of protocols or protocols that are no longer relevant. Did you come across anything with regards to like, not forgetting these?
I didn't come across with any ones like that were forgotten. That's really interesting. One sort of related idea is the accident rates in small businesses versus large businesses. Like when we're talking about memory, it's like small workplaces have a much lower ability to remember safety protocols. And so if you have a 10-person company and one of them leaves, that's a 10% turnover in your whole company. That person is leaving with a ton of memory about the protocols. So like the bandwidth of a group is very important in determining how safe it is. And that bandwidth is determined highly by the network size. So the smaller a company, the smaller the network size, the lower the memory you have, the higher chance you're going to forget.
And just another question with regards to this. For the companies, for example, large companies or industries which have had a lot of safety protocols, did you read anything about the trade-off between the increase in safety and, for example, limits of innovation or being able to like move to better innovate, be able to create better solutions because of the some sort of safety burden on the organizations themselves?
Yeah, and it's this thing that got pointed out by a French safety researcher. I'm totally blanking on the name right now. It'll come back to me. But the safer that things get, the fewer accidents there are. So when an accident does happen, it's this very scary event. And there's a lot of public pressure to act and show that you're making things safer and trying to avoid that event. So one of the things that happens to big companies is that they need to demonstrate that things are safe but things are safe when there's no way to prove it because you can't measure this dynamic non-event. So you have to show that you're investing. So it becomes this problem that you're measuring the wrong thing, and it's like a doctor that needs to diagnose you with stuff to stay employed as your personal doctor. They're going to keep finding things to give you, but the reality is that organization could be completely healthy. It's just that there's a public pressure to spend on safety because people have anxiety about it.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to speak too much. So anybody who has questions, please do raise your hands. But this is such an interesting bunny trail. I see Steve in the Zoom chat has posted about Japan having the cultural stones to remind of tsunami. And that reminded me of this anecdote I just heard that around the world, basically almost no cultures have a word for tsunamis except Japan. And most places just use the word tsunami. And when the Indian Ocean tsunami happened in 2003, all that region, Southeast Asia, India, most of the places kind of had no idea what was going on and got hit hard. But one island in Indonesia survived, and it happens to be the only island outside of Japan that has a word for tsunami. I just posted in the Discord. The word is Simong, and it's one island. And the reason is that they preserved a cultural memory from like some ancient tsunami from Krakatoa or whatever in song. So there was like a folk song about like the waters rising and water's getting sucked out, because that's what happens in a tsunami. First, there's like an earthquake, then the water all recedes suddenly, and then it comes right back in. So all that was very precisely and literally remembered as song. And that's why that was the one island that kind of survived. So that's one example I wanted to flag of like long-term cultural memory of Black Swan protocols. But the other point I wanted to make is this point of if you actually do very well with a safety protocol, nothing happens, and then people start to question whether you needed to do anything at all. And that's happened. COVID was a good example. That was like a discourse that kept popping up. It was like, you guys overreacted. Look, nothing happened. So few people died. Well, it's because some people looked at history, learned the lessons from 1917 or whatever, and reacted well enough. And that's why nothing happened. But it's like the non-event becomes evidence of sort of the event being impossible or something like that. There's some very weird Russell's paradox thing going on here that's more than just memory psychology. So I kind of want to bookmark that for more people to think about if you have smart thoughts on that issue.
It's just a reaction to that, Venkat. It almost feels like not only is there a memory issue, but you have an incentive to disregard the importance of the protocol itself. Like the environment itself like incentivizes you to try to remove it.
Other questions or comments for Timber? Noticing that there's a good chunk of new people in our chat here, and recognizing Kayla and Lori and Stephanie, maybe people who aren't always joining us on the town halls. If you guys have questions or comments.
I feel like a couple of these are my old coworkers, and they've heard me talk about this stuff ad nauseum.
Fair enough.
But I'll just continue rattling along that thread for a bit until somebody has a question. One of the problems is these tsunamis and pandemics are categorically different in how we should be responding to them with safety protocols than things like explosions or car accidents, because some are systemic and some are not. One of the big changes that the coal mining safety protocol world struggled with was the creation of really big mines where the fates of miners got bundled up together. So in the past, people were digging pit mines and they were safe if they were safe, and if they got hurt, it didn't hurt the people in the mine next to them. But in the big mines in the USA where they were mining bituminous coal, there was a ton of dust. And for the first time in this industry, it was like your choice affected the well-being of hundreds of other people. And the same thing today, is your choice to ignore protocol for COVID, for example, could affect hundreds of thousands of people. And we're just not used to that. And it leads to some very counterintuitive, like almost what could be perceived as paranoid behavior.
We've had a couple comments in the live stream on YouTube, and I'll just read them out here. Nicholas says, it occurs to me a field with a heavy amount of protocol evolution is in airplane regulation and procedures.
Yeah, it sure is. I mean, airplane safety is probably the safety researchers' bread and butter in terms of case studies and how much stuff gets measured. And it also benefits from this issue where the accidents are very rare, and it leads to this effect of, because accidents are so rare in the airline industry, when they do happen, it's this massive catastrophe and it makes all the headlines in the world. And because of the availability bias that generates, we, as the public, overestimate the likelihood of an airline accident way too much. And when these accidents happen, that leads to lobbying like governments to do something about airline safety. And they do, because that's how our like political system works. It's like, if there's public attention on something, there's pressure to do something about it. Even if it's not optimal, there will be an incentive to illustrate that you're doing stuff to make things safer. Even if you're not, even if what you're doing is making things less safe, it will look like you're making things safe to those that are concerned.
Dorian, question?
Yeah, just you're getting me thinking about airlines, commercial air travel in general. And one of the things that is interesting about that is the near miss database. And because it's sort of like, yeah, it didn't happen, but for the precautions that we took. And I'm wondering to the extent that there is a near miss database for other stuff. Do you know?
I really don't. The near miss database for airlines it's really interesting. There are always these conversations in safety about, okay, like we need to measure near misses and we need to collect data on leading indicators. So like, is our spending in this area going down? Are we spending less time on training? Can we start measuring these things that lead to certain safety outcomes? And it's useful, I think, but it can be overdone. In the case of airline safety, it's like the accidents are so rare now that every dollar invested into that thing, I don't know if we should be investing in that when we've got a workplace health crisis for psychological illness and heart disease and lung disease and diabetes. Like, these are all now low-hanging fruits relative to increases in physical safety.
And I guess like a near misses in that don't really compute, right? Like, it's like, oh, I almost got heart disease or diabetes, but I didn't because like that. Yeah, something that develops over decades is you just got me.
The data requirements for that are just, the
No.
data requirements for a near miss for an accident are insane, because the amount of ways that something can go wrong is basically infinite. And then you add on like, okay, the amount of things that can go wrong are basically infinite, but then we need to measure it over 20 years. It's just,
well, then there's also like the privacy, concerns and all that business too. Like, no way, nobody would go for that.
definitely.
All right. Any last minute questions or comments for Timber and his research on safety protocols? All right. Well, thank you so much, Timber, for giving us a summary of your output from the summer protocols. And yeah, it was very interesting, and look forward to seeing the full essay being released sometime in the near-ish future, potentially. Thank you everyone for joining us. As I mentioned at the top of the talk here, our next town hall will be on Wednesday, November 8th at the same time with Simon de la Wavoie. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time.